Welcome again to the Kit Noir Film Festival, and it's my great luxury to be able to introduce people who need no introduction. Professor Annette Insdorf is, of course, a professor at Columbia University School of the Arts, where she works in the Film and Media Studies program. She's published many books. Most recently, however, she's published Intimations, the cinema of Wojciech Haas, and also Cinematic Overtures. I think she has a couple of series that are available for streaming on Filmstruck as well. And she also moderates many discussions with filmmakers and actors at the 92nd Street Y here in New York City. And she will be talking today with Paul Schrader, who also needs no introduction. He is, of course, a celebrated screenwriter, filmmaker, responsible for many of the scripts with filmmaker Martin Scorsese for Last Temptation of Christ, Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, of course, as well as many significant films himself, American Gigolo, Affliction, The Canyons. He's also a film critic, writing for the LA Free Press back in the day, the author of Transcendental Style in Film back in 1972, which is, as Annette is showing us, okay, that's good to know. In 1972 also, he was the author of the essay and film comment, Notes on Film Noir, which is one of the significant English language essays in really placing noir on the agenda of film scholarship in the English language world. In that essay, he writes at one point that, or he wonders at one point whether what the 1930s were to the 1960s, the 1940s and film noir would be to the 1970s. And he, of course, is one of the American filmmakers who helped turn that prophecy into reality. So please welcome both Annette Insdorf and Paul Schrader. Thank you.
Well, it is such a joy to be on stage with Paul Schrader, who I've been admiring for a few decades now, not only as a screenwriter and director, but as a voice of really astute insight into film history. And I hope you'll all forgive me for dressing totally in my best film noir attire. I wanted to be as darkly glittering as possible. And I want to start off by asking a few questions about Notes on Film Noir from '72, which, as I assume you know, has been anthologized at least 3 times. You can easily find Paul Schrader's essay, whether you go to Genre Reader 2 from 1995, Movies and Mass Culture that John Belton edited in '96, and Awake in the Dark, which the anthology that was edited by David Denby in 1977. I actually couldn't remember who first used the term film noir, so I looked it up. Apparently, it was a French critic named Nino Frank in a 1946 essay which singled out 2 films that are in this series, Murder, My Sweet and Double Indemnity, as quintessential examples. So I'm going to start, Paul, by asking you, you wrote that film noir is defined by tone rather than genre, and since I quote this to my students, I'm going to just quote this now. It depends more on choreography than sociology, and American critics have always been slow on the uptake when it comes to visual style. Like its protagonists, film noir is more interested in style than theme, whereas American critics have been traditionally more interested in theme than style. You wrote that in '72. What do you think today?
Well, first let me put that in a couple things in a little context. That so-called essay was, in fact, was program notes. Gary Essert started a festival called Filmex in Los Angeles, and I was a critic in Los Angeles at that time. And he asked me, he was looking for ideas of programs. And I said, well, why don't you do something on film noir? And he didn't know what that was. And there had been one essay in English by Raymond Durgnat in Screen. And then, of course, there was the book. I'm not sure how to pronounce their names, Board in Charmenton, whatever, the French book called Film Noir. So, but apart from that, it hadn't been written about yet. So I selected 5 films and then wrote a preface and then wrote about the 5 films. You know, at that time, it was, first of all, there was nothing to read about film noir. Now you could probably fill that wall with books written about film noir or scholarly papers written about it. And there was no way to see the films. So you had to sort of guess, you know, which films were worth seeing, because you couldn't do the encyclopedic thing you do now and just see all of Phil Carlson's films and all of whomever's films. And so a number of real film noir gems, obviously I overlooked because I had not heard of them, no one has written about them, no one I knew had seen them, you know. I was fortunate in the 5 I picked, all turned out to be evergreens. And so I was lucky that way. But so I'm a former expert on film noir. But there are many people more expert than me. And that said, you can repeat the question.
Well, do you still think that American film critics are more concerned with theme than style, and that film noir has therefore not necessarily gotten its due, given that, in your view at the time, it was characterized more by choreography than sociology?
I probably underestimated the sociological aspect. And my feeling about style versus content comes more from my background, I guess, than a realistic assessment of the world, because I had come from a church background where if you had something to say, you said it in words, and you didn't, and there was no style, just, you know, churches that looked like courtrooms. And so I was just at that point in my life where I was starting to realize that images could be ideas and style could be an intellectual conveyance. It wasn't just decoration. And but that said, I would say it's probably an equal mix between the sociology is very heavy.
I think, though, that from where I sit and teach, over the past 40 years, 45 years now, there has been more and more attention paid to style, and therefore more and more attention to auteurs. You know, we now talk about distinguishing a film by Dmitrik from a film by Phil Carlson, as you just invoked, or Richard Brooks. There are so many possibilities. Do you, even when you think of how people review your own films, is there not now the danger that, especially in the academy, we're so concerned with style that we sometimes don't care that much about what it's for in terms of conveying a vision of the world?
Yeah, here's I was just, I mentioned to you, I was just on a 3-campus seminary tour with my new film, First Reformed, which comes out June 1st, and with the new version of the book. So I was at Calvin College and Fuller Theological and Yale Divinity. And something came up interesting that applies to this. Because in that book, I talk about spiritual style as being a way. It's not about content, it's not about the what, it's about the how. And that spirituality is involved in the process, not the identification. But then, I had to then make this caveat when the Q&A would start, which is, even though I firmly believe that spiritual cinema is about style, not content, it always seems to work better when the content is about religious people. So the film I've just made is about a small parsonage, and Ethan Hawke is the minister. Now, I could have made that about a plumber who lost faith in plumbing. But somehow it works better when it's a minister who's lost faith in his beliefs. So theoretically, it is about style, but practically, it starts being about content very quickly. And if you made a film noir style without film noir content, I don't think we would recognize it as film noir.
I am one of the only lucky people in this room who has actually seen First Reformed. I think it's one of Paul Schrader's best films in like 20 years. And I actually was struck, and I know that no one here can follow what I'm about to say if you haven't seen the film, but because it has a voiceover narration, because you actually have shots of the handwritten journal that Ethan Hawke's character, and by the way, he is remarkable in this film, is one of Ethan Hawke's most powerful performances. I couldn't help at moments but be reminded of the screenplay you wrote for Taxi Driver, which I would suggest could be a film noir in color. I don't know whether you were thinking about that as you wrote the screenplay, which you did shortly after, I guess, the notes on film noir. But in First Reformed, I get the feeling that the character there, even though it's not a relationship to the Vietnam War like the vet that Travis Bickle is in Taxi Driver, this is a man who's marked by war as well. His son, in fact, was killed in Iraq in battle. But he sees around him a world that is as, quote, polluted. It's a world of detritus, of garbage, not like the literal world of 42nd Street, Times Square for Travis Bickle, but global warming and contamination. And there seems to me a connection among these. Yeah. And I guess what I'm really asking is, do you see these two films as connected to the notes on film noir?
But I'll segue away from film noir and come back. Taxi Driver comes from Pickpocket. I was a critic. I was living in a house full of UCLA film students. They were all making a film for Roger Corman, a biker film. And I just couldn't get interested in what they were doing. I just thought it was such a trivial thing they were doing. And whereas I was part of the revolution, and I was, a film critic. And I was high-minded. And then I went to see this film, which was released in Los Angeles about 10 years after, 10 years after it was released in France. And I was just dumbfounded. I walked out. I said, I could make a film like that. That's just a guy. He sits in his room and he writes. Then he goes out and does some stuff. Then he comes back in his room and writes some more. And then he runs into somebody. And then he comes back in his room. I said, I could make that film. And a year later, I wrote Taxi Driver. And that has now morphed into 5 films about a man in his room. He goes from Taxi Driver to American Gigolo to Light Sleeper to Walker and now to First Reformed. And so that is one sort of subcategory of films I've been involved in. Now, my feeling about film noir, so I do not think Taxi Driver is film noir, but nor do I think it's Nouvelle Vague. We don't have a very good term for that period of American cinema from 66 or 68 to 80. Some people just call it the golden age, but that's, I think the 40s were the golden age, or the 30s. But I don't know what you call that.
The New Hollywood?
Yeah, New Hollywood. So somebody has to get a better term for it. But I believe that critical language should be as precise as possible. Otherwise, it has no meaning. And so if you talk about spirituality in films, you have to be very rigid, because otherwise, every film ever made is a film about redemption. You read these books by church people, and they're just sticking Jesus Christ everywhere. And you've got to be very rigid. So I have a very rigid definition of film noir. I believe it is a period of film history, like the Nouvelle Vague, like German Expressionism. So German Expressionism starts about 1920, wraps up about 29. Nouvelle Vague is even shorter. What is that?
59.
No, but it begins in about 55, doesn't it?
Well, 59 was the year in which
Yeah, it
Truffaut,
exploded.
Godard, René all made their first features, so we tend to call 59 the originating year.
Yeah, but I know I've been working on a project. I don't know if it'll get made, but it's a remake of Shoot the Piano Player, and I was going to do it with Justin Timberlake, but I lost Justin. But if I got to remake that, that would not be a Nouvelle Vague film. It would not. And Taxi Driver is not one, and neither is Hollywood Confidential or Grifters or any of those great kind of, for me, for these terms to have meaning, they have to have boundaries. Otherwise, anything can be a film noir. And anything can be anything, you know. So, I prefer to think of it as a historical period, which started, you could see the hint of it coming around 42, and then 44 started to come in, and then 46, 47, all of a sudden it was going high gear, started tailing off around 53, 54, and you know, there were a few latecomers, and by the time of Touch of Evil, that was the official.
Epitaph is the word you used in Notes on Film Noir.
Yeah. I mean, the Touch of Evil was the official spreading of the ashes, just like Wild Brunches, the spreading of the ashes of the Western.
And yet, I mean, it's funny that I still question whether Touch of Evil is the epitaph for film noir. I still think it's one of the great films. But you know that it's the link, in a certain sense, between film noir and the French New Wave, because it was shown. Orson Welles' pulpy B-movie that Universal didn't know how to release was shown at the Brussels World's Fair. This was around 58, I believe, when it was just finished, and the jury voted it the best film. So what, you might say? The jury included François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. They were deeply marked by Touch of Evil. And I think Shoot the Piano Player, which is ostensibly a mixed tone film, mixed genres, it has many moments of film noir. It's in black and white. It has a doomed hero. It has flashbacks. So I think you are absolutely right in suggesting that film noir could be seen as a genre limited primarily to the 1940s into, let's say, the early 50s. But what is fascinating for me as a film educator is how many of the elements of film noir, both stylistic and thematic, have seeped into all kinds of motion pictures in so many different countries, so that whether it's a Paul Schrader, and Scorsese actually did say at one point that he thought that Mean Streets was a film noir in color. And he also acknowledged at one point about Robert Wise's Noir, The Setup, that it influenced Raging Bull. So it continues. It has life in all these little tributaries.
Yeah, saying film noir in color, for me, is saying it's an animation film with actors. But no, like you take Murder by Sweet, you know, and who did the remake? Dick Francis? No, Dick Richards.
Yes. Well, actually, there was one with Robert Mitchum. Wasn't that Robert Altman?
No.
No, I'm sorry. You are absolutely right.
Dick Richards.
Yes.
And it's a very good film. I just don't know if it's a film noir. It's like a film noir. But is it? Yeah.
Okay, so let's say, to go back to your, because you delineated with absolute perfection, in my opinion, what were at the time, this was 72, what you saw as the major characteristics of noir in terms of the genre of that time. War and post-war disillusionments. So obviously, yes, we are talking about an extremely time-based phenomenon where the returning soldiers, the suspicion of, was my wife faithful? Why is she working in a job now? She was home. Some of those elements are there.
And also the resentment of the wives who had nice jobs. All of a sudden, their husband come home and they're supposed to go back in the kitchen.
Yep, that's a problem. Then you talked about post-war realism, the fact that the second wave, especially of film noir, was now being shot in the streets, so that you get films of Jules Dassin like Night in the City, right?
Yeah. Well, it all had to do with that Bolex during World War II. All those guys, you know, the five who came back or whatever, they were all using that Bolex, running around in Europe shooting footage. And when they came back, all of a sudden they started making Naked City, and they're doing footage on the streets. They were freed from the huge, you know, contraption of cinema in the studio.
Absolutely. And by the way, can I just put in a little plug here, because some of you may not know what Five Came Back refers to. For me, it was the best documentary of 2017. It was shown on Netflix, and it was in 3 parts, basically, focusing on the 5 great American filmmakers who went off to fight during World War II, but using a contemporary filmmaker as a kind of voice through which the work comes to us. So you have, for example, if I'm remembering correctly, Guillermo del Toro on Frank Capra. You have Spielberg on William Wyler. You have Coppola on John Huston. Mark, help me, I'm forgetting some of them. Lawrence Kasdan on George Stevens. And the 5th one, John Ford. Who's the one on John Ford?
I don't know.
Anyway, please see this documentary, because it is one of the truly great illuminations about how war and filmmaking came together to give filmmakers a new maturity of vision, among other things. But you're right about the technical aspect.
Yeah, well, I mean, I taught some courses at Columbia a few years back on the supposition that the history of film or art is not really a history of personalities or of social movements. It is a history of technology. And that as technology evolves, the art evolves. So that when they devised that yellow pigment in Netherlands that Turner used for those paintings, he could make those paintings. It wasn't that he didn't have that image in his head before. He just couldn't do it technically. And now he had the chemicals to do it. And the same thing is true about cameras and lenses and microphones and iPhones, you know. And so that you could track the history of cinema by the history of innovation, technological innovation.
And by the way, I sat in on that course. It was one of my great experiences as a professor to become a student again. Every week I sat in 511 Dodge taking notes on what Professor Schrader was offering us, because they were gems. And now I teach analysis of film language, but it's a kind of amalgam of what you were doing and my own particular interest. By the way, I just remembered, it was the director Paul Greengrass on John Ford. And it's all based on Mark Harris's book, Five Came Back. You talked in your essay about the economic and technological realities of wartime filmmaking, because one thing that I think many of us forget, and I'd like to bring it back up, is that the material limitations of wartime filmmaking meant that location shooting was difficult due to travel restrictions, so interior studio sets had to be utilized, and also that spare production design, because they didn't have too much money. That was so great because it made the characters more isolated in the decor, and the tight budgets minimized lighting as well. So the the dark, constricted mood was both economical and psychological.
I mean, I remember hearing in Japan during World War II, they were so low on raw stock that the clap, they wouldn't say action, that the clap was action, so they could save 3 seconds.
Okay, so now to go back to some of the things that you were offering, because I'm curious how much of this is still for you crucial. You talked about the stylistics. The majority of scenes are lit for night, you said. I'm quoting now. Forgive me, but I really love Schrader's language. So, ceiling lights are hung low and floor lamps are seldom more than 5 feet high. One always has the suspicion that if the lights were all suddenly flipped on, the characters would shriek and shrink from the scene like Count Dracula at noontime. And you talk about German Expressionism and the importance of that off-kilter universe, the oblique lines rather than horizontals. So is that stylistic element for you still limited primarily to the 40s?
That cadre of German Jews that came over must have been about 40 or 50 strong.
Well, 40 or 50 in terms of the very big names that we recognize today, like Fritz Lang, Otto Preminger. But guess what? There was a PBS special a few years ago. The number of film professionals who fled the rise of Nazism in Europe to Hollywood, 800.
Yeah.
Because that includes the composers, the screenwriters, production designers, etc.
And they all socialized in Los Angeles, if you read the history of the period. And they all felt this huge burden of failure. The failure of Europe after World War I. And so it was a pretty dour crowd. And obviously I just filtered right in when you have some of the most talented and intelligent people in your community weighted down with this kind of guilt, it's going to come out.
But not just guilt. I mean, I do see World War II as one of the most prominent forces in terms of the development of film noir, because after all, you have, for example, Robert Siodmak with Phantom Lady in 44. He did The Killers, I think, in 45. Wait, actually, I have all these notes. Why don't I get this more precisely? Here we go. Well, Otto Preminger with moody classics like Laura, Where the Sidewalk Ends, Whirlpool. You have Wilder, Billy Wilder, with Double Indemnity in 1944, The Lost Weekend in 45. You have Robert Siodmak, Phantom Lady was 44, it was The Suspect in 1945. And of course, Hitchcock, who made his first American film, Rebecca, in 1940. His work there and in Suspicion in 41, didn't that provide much of the material of film noir? Yeah. Guilt.
Yeah, it may be an apocryphal story, but the story goes that Goebbels offered Lang the head of the film business in Berlin. He went home and started making plans to leave.
Actually, it's even more than that. He left the very next morning, even though his wife and co-screenwriter Thea von Harbu remained in Germany.
Yeah, so that's the the stature of the people you were getting, and it must have been very strange in Hollywood at that time because these guys were not Americanized. Particularly you hear them talk, and the accents are very, very thick.
But one thing that I think characterizes the work of all of these, from Fritz Lang to Billy Wilder, it's not just guilt. They saw or heard firsthand what human nature could devolve into during World War II, as Jews who had to flee especially. Their vision of human nature could no longer be the rosy, happy end view that Hollywood films had been known for until World War II. And I think that there's a new bleakness. It's not just a dour crowd. There is a cynicism in these films. There is a sense of the individual who is doomed, not just by external circumstances, but that which lies within.
Yeah. The documentary, if I've come back, talked about that too, how guys like Capra and Wilder and Ford, assumed a more somber, dark tone after seeing what they saw.
Absolutely. And then again, maybe this is something else that fuels your argument, that film noir is primarily a 40s phenomenon. Psychoanalysis was first becoming cinematic terrain in the 40s. That's when you started having this fascination with perversity, with disorder, whether literally in Spellbound, Hitchcock, or figuratively in a film like Laura. And it's in these movies you get the feeling that the character with whom you identify, often the detective, he's trying to make sense out of such puzzling clues. And even when there's sort of the semblance that at the end it all comes together, I mean, at the end of The Big Sleep, you're still going, what? You're still going, I don't think this really has a happy end, even though it seems to be one. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I was just listening. I wasn't thinking.
No, but I mean, for you, is the psychoanalytic component
yeah.
crucial?
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, when you start talking about the arts, the first, when, Freud landed like a bombshell in Paris. The Dadists and the Surrealists came right out of Freud, and they were completely upfront about it. It says, without Freud, there is no Dadaism, there is no Surrealism. And so this whole idea of the dream state and the dream consciousness, but that all turned sour. And I'm thinking of writing an article about this, but I think it was Marcel Duchamp who said the only people who took the Surrealists seriously were the Nazis. Nobody else thought we were serious. But the Nazis knew we were that famous exhibition of degenerate art that they did in 1938, was it?
Sounds right.
And where all the modern masters were put on display by Hitler, Braque, Picasso, everybody, as degenerate art. And so the Nazis took them seriously. But that explosion of psychotherapy and how serious it was, and particularly in Hollywood, how many people were in therapy in Hollywood because they had the money and they had the sort of education, and they were freed from the provinciality of those people who thought, you didn't do that. And so there were a lot. It was a bubble. It was a go-go business, in the 50s in Hollywood. So a lot of people were thinking just like that, and a lot of movies were made, with shrinks in them. That's gone now. We don't make movies with shrinks anymore. We don't even make movies with Jews anymore.
I'm not going to go there right now. We'll save that for later. But in a way, it does acknowledge what we've been saying beforehand, that film noir of the 40s would be unimaginable without the expatriate population, the Jewish artists who fled World War II, and who were marked to some extent by what was happening. And then by 45, 46, everyone in the world, everyone certainly in the United States, was suddenly aware of the depths to which civilized human beings could sink, whether in the name of ideology, patriotism, that people could destroy other people on that scale. For me, film noir is directly emanating from that.
Yeah. And also, there was an artificial optimism that had to be held to during the war, because how do you fight a war if you think you're going to lose? So everybody had to be lying to themselves to some degree, saying we're going to win this thing, when there were periods in that time where it didn't look like they were going to win the thing. And so finally, they're released from that, and of course that's a downer too.
That's right. Now, in introducing us, my revered colleague Rob King cited how you said the 40s may be to the 70s what the 30s were to the 60s. Can we say that the 70s may be to our time what the 40s were to the 70s?
I don't know what our time is.
Well, filmmaking in 2017, 18, 19.
I think I don't have a handle on the Gestalt. I really don't. I think virtually everything we've learned in the last 100 years doesn't apply. And that we are entering, I used to think that we were entering a period of transition, but now I realize that we have entered a period of permanent transition. And just like your computer is out of date before you can open the box, the movie technology that you're using will be out of date before the movie comes out. And that goes not only for the cameras, but delivery systems and all of the technical elements. The monetization changes every 4 or 5 months. So I have no idea what to call this period we're in. And You know, when our AI successors finally build the museum to human technology, they'll have a name for it. That's going to be a great museum.
I guess what I'm wondering, and maybe we can't answer this on this stage or even in this room, is whether the 70s, the films that were made at that time, many of which were calling back to the 40s. I mean, literally Chinatown could have been called Chandlertown, because Robert Towne wrote it as an homage to the world of Raymond Chandler. But so many of the films that I think have been the best films that have been coming out of what is now no longer really Hollywood, it's an amalgam of independent New York filmmaking and Hollywood. It calls back to the new Hollywood of the 70s, to the time when films like Taxi Driver and Chinatown and the movies of Cassavetes, which had their own darkness, like Killing of a Chinese Bookie, that we continue, I'm suggesting, to be inspired by the films of the 70s that were themselves inspired by the films of the 40s.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I mean, I just don't have a hold on what has happened to audiovisual entertainment, you know, to the over 500 scripted TV shows that are now being shot per year in this country, not to mention those being shot elsewhere, and that's just scripted TV. So we live in this tsunami of product, and how we get our hands around it and know what it is. You know, every once in a while you'll see a film and you say, that's a marker, that's a marker, that's a marker. But a lot of it is just volume. I mean, one of the things that has changed, I think, is directors no longer feel the need to have a consistent style. That's a choice. So many things that we used to think were rules, we now think of as choices, because we can do anything. Everything is fungible. So in the past, if a character wearing a red jacket walked in the exterior into a room, then you cut inside the room, and he comes in wearing a green jacket, that used to be called a mistake, a continuity mistake. Now it's called a creative choice. And audiences understand it's a creative choice. Audiences say, oh, look, they got his jacket wrong. No, they say, oh, they decided to change his jacket. And so we live in this world where you can mix and match and techniques and formats, and you know, so you see Mommy, where all of a sudden, boom, it switches into a vertical format right in the middle. You know, so it's kind of wild, and also it's very more and more youth-driven in terms of creativity. If you don't know how to make a film by the time you're 14, you probably never will. I mean, I don't want to malign film schools, but basically everything you learn in film schools, you know, Spielberg was a prototype of this. You know, these kids are making films, and they're learning all about making films without even seeing films. You know, so.
Well, that brings in a whole question that I did want to address before we open this up for audience questions, and that's criteria. You know, what are the criteria, whether we're approaching film noir or movies in general? And I came across another article that you wrote for Film Comment, but a bit more recent. It was 2006, October, and it's your extended essay on the film canon called Canon Fodder. It acknowledges 5 criteria used to form your film canon. And just to summarize, beauty, right? We all know what that is, more or less. Strangeness, right? The magical, unpredictable, original. Uniformity of form and content, how film and subject are fused together. I hope I'm getting this all right. I was busy copy and pasting. Tradition, how well the artwork relates and responds to prior art. And repeatability, how well an artwork stands the test of time. Then you added one film-specific criterion, viewer engagement, the degree to which a film involves the viewer emotionally and intellectually, as opposed to a more passive level of response. And then you also call attention to an age-old criterion, morality. But you lessen its relevance to the film canon with the notion that all great art strikes a moral chord, therefore, quote, no work that fails to strike moral chords can be canonical, unquote. Would you say that you have the same criteria 12 years later?
I don't know why I wrote that.
I actually thought it was pretty good.
No, what happened was that I was asked to write a Harold Bloom type book on the film canon. And so I spent a lot of time researching it. And I finally decided that I no longer believed in the film canon. And so instead of writing the book, I would write an article about the film canon and why I no longer believed it. So it was a kind of back and forth kind of article, because I said, if I did believe this is what I would believe. So I don't know if there is a canon really anymore, but those are pretty good criteria.
Yeah, I mean, the film canon is actually a subject right now of intense debate in Columbia's film program, and I'm very happy about that fact, because I'm one of the guilty people who's been teaching film history for decades, focusing on white men movies. Film noir is primarily white male movies. And one of the things that we are necessarily rethinking these days is how to widen the canon. In other words, if there's a given that we're working with a canon, that certain films are more sanctioned than others or more noble than others. So how do we start rethinking whether it should just be the best films of a particular moment or of a particular director, and how do we widen it to include women directors, directors of color, films that were made perhaps in this genre but in other countries with other kinds of rhythms and concerns. And I've really been thinking about this very seriously for a few months now.
Like in black cinema, like Michaud, you have very important works for the history of black cinema, which completely are outside of the ken of normal film studies until quite recently when they started putting them in. So, I mean, black filmmakers knew about these films, just that white filmmakers didn't know.
Well, actually, I'm just remembering a film from about 15 years ago, One False Move. Everyone called it this wonderful little gritty noir, and it was directed by a black filmmaker. And that was like, good, one step forward. You don't have to be white to make that film noir. And there's also John Dahl, who is white, was also making these wonderful neo-noirs about 15, 20 years ago with Linda Fiorentino. Nicolas Cage, I think, was maybe in one of them, one of your actors. Red Rock, exactly.
Yeah, Red Rock, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I could ask, I have 6 pages of notes here, but obviously I'm over-prepared. And we would like to open this up to questions from the audience, because I'm sure that many of you here have your own either favorite noirs or questions about noir that you would like to ask of someone like Paul Schrader, who's been thinking very seriously about them for a long time. Gordon Kitt, our benefactor, the festival is named for him, yes? We should give you a microphone. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun before the mic was set up. Sorry.
One of the things I didn't talk about in that article way back then, but I know more about now because I've directed some films, is the acting styles were different.
Of course.
And, there's that famous quote from Spencer Tracy. He said, at the end of the movie, if you look up, you get the awards. If you look down, you get the reviews. And they were definitely looking down in these films, And there had been a whole period where, actors were much more thought they had to act. And with these kinds of stories, you don't act as much as you are acted upon.
Well put.
All right, I actually have 2 questions, and they're probably interrelated. The first one is the Maltese Falcon. There are 3 versions. It was actually written in the 1930s. So it's a pre-war story. And yet, it's only the 1940 version is a noir version. So why would you consider the later version noir?
Well, you're going to have to enlighten me here. Maybe you can just run through the versions. There's obviously John Huston.
There's a 36 and 41 version, or 37 and 41?
41 is Houston. There were, I think, 2 before that. Thank you. 30. I'm going to just repeat that. 31, Roy Del Ruth and Ricardo Cortez. 1936, Satan Met a Lady, starring Betty Davis.
Yeah, and I haven't seen those, so I can't answer that question. I assume it was made again after Houston.
Was there? I don't know of a remake after Houston's.
Sure, there's a TV remake somewhere.
Right, but nothing that has the status of the Maltese Falcon, right?
They remade Casablanca
Ye-
with David Soul as Humphrey Bogart.
Okay.
All right, well, let me skip to the second question then, which is, we're referring to noir as being an American genre, a uniquely American genre, and yet, as you've said, all these directors and filmmakers were actually European. So what makes it an American genre as opposed to really a European genre?
It's when that old sensibility, now crushed and bleak, hits the sunny coast of California. That's, when those German expatriates fall into the petri dish of Santa Monica, you start to get this. An act of creation is always at some point elements collide, and these guys, when you read about them, they were so, California. Hollywood really wasn't even much in the world news loop. You'd see newsreels, but Hollywood was relatively unaffected by what was going on. Long Beach, of course, was a huge base, but so I can just see how the creative urge would, you take this dark seed and drop it into such a fertile environment and see the monstrous fruit that comes out.
Thank you.
There's a hand right there.
I think going back to this running theme about the film noir being a specific period, and then what we're doing in the last 50, 60 years as being neo-noir. Do you think that, this is for both of you, do you feel like that it's just an homage and that it loses something because it's not really something organic? These films, like you mentioned Red Rock West and Blood Simple, and a lot of other films that are nodding toward those films of the 30s, 40s.
Yeah, well, they are tips of the hat. They're referencing it. Maybe Taxi Driver would be a good example. It just clearly references that world, but that's not what is driving Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver was being driven by 1974, not by 1944. And so is Blood Simple really being driven by its year, or is it just a rehash? I would make the case that Blood Simple was very much a product of its time, and therefore it is its own thing. It's not a neo-noir. It's just referencing. But if you made a neo-noir that was purely of a previous time, then it's a lost effort. When Altman takes the noir and totally turns it upside down in his blender, I don't think that film is a film noir.
The Long Goodbye?
Long Goodbye. He's playing with a genre, but it's very much of Altman's time.
Rather than take that on, I'm going to let one more question. Yes? Can you use the microphone so everyone hears you?
I guess my original view of film noir when I first started watching it 40 years ago was that it was always at the core there was a woman involved who could not be trusted. You know, out of the past, Jane Greer, you know, the Maltese Falcon, Double Indemnity, the Postman Always Rings Twice, and there was like it was basic at its core, kind of about a fear of women. But I think since then, my feeling is that my definition has broadened, and I just wanted to know what your view on women and women who can't be trusted, women who turn on men, all of that, as being film noir essential.
Well, I mean, the term they were using at that time was Black Widow, which is, you know, she's a spider that will kill you. And again, you know, you have to think of the war, and you have to think of several years without female companionship. You're coming back, and your attitudes toward women are not what they were when you left, when you thought you were getting married in 3 months. And so that gets boiled into the stew as well. You know, the kind of power women have, the fear that men have of that power, that they can kill you, and maybe they will, and in fact they do. That was in the air. It became less so as the materialistic 50s started, you know, getting into gear, and the move toward the suburbs, you know, changed the role of the family a lot. But the difference is, you say a film like The Grifters. Now, Anjelica Huston, she's not the femme fatale. She's not the Black Widow. She's the gangster, right? You know.
And Annette Bening is another kind of that in the film. But I would suggest that maybe there was a revision of the woman of film noir by the 1970s, because I think of one of the great movies of that era, Klute. Klute was directed by Alan Pakula. It starred Donald Sutherland as the detective whose name provides the title, but it's really the story of Bree, the prostitute who's played by Jane Fonda, and she won an Academy Award for that film. It's in color, but it's very dark, and so is the moral aspect of the story. It's also about suspicion, betrayal, and a man and a woman somehow learning to trust each other rather than the initial setup where they don't. And I couldn't help but notice when I watched it again recently that visually Klute links up with the best of 40s detective thrillers by presenting paranoid urban enclosure with perversity and violence and evil lurking just over the rooftop. In fact, it's visually similar to Alan Pakula's other great 1970s film, All the President's Men, which substitutes political corruption for sexual.
I think that's a very good comparison, because you know, that typical film noir narration, which you have Out of the Past, which is, she didn't come back that day. I knew she would come back. I knew I would go back. I knew I couldn't walk away. I knew it would turn out bad. You know, all of this is doom, doom, doom. So taking characters who are predisposed to doom and saying there is another solution to this than the predetermined destruction of your relationship. There is a possible linkage.
Right.
And that clearly puts Klute outside of film noir territory.
But it connects Klute to a movie like The Big Sleep, which is different from the novel on which it's based. The novel has no happy ending. And I'm not saying that it's exactly happy in The Big Sleep, but you have Bogart and Bacall, who've been baiting each other throughout the film and not able to, I mean, Bogart can't trust Bacall. But at the very end of the film, when he asks her, "What's wrong with you?" her answer is, "Nothing you can't fix." And the two of them move together. We don't actually see the kiss, but we do see the ashtray with two cigarettes lying next to one another, and the smoke rises. They're going to smoke happily ever after. In other words, it's as happy or as optimistic as film noir gets, but it does posit the possibility of a man and a woman connecting and overcoming the meaninglessness inherent in the universe, and that's because it was a Howard Hawks film. Hawks was injecting something of his own vision into the darker Chandler universe.
Yeah, I mean, I just bought, I haven't read it yet, the big biography on Cornell Woolrich. And, I mean, if anyone can sort of stand in as the American epicenter of film noir, is that very, very sad life, you know. But he wrote so many of these.
Yeah.
I mean,
whether it was Cornell Woolrich or William Irish, you know, take either name, is the same person.
yeah, but I think at least 10 of his books were, and this is while he was living with his mom.
And then, of course, Truffaut adapts the same writer when he starts making his little noirs in the 1960s. We have time for one more question. Actually, there are two quickies, but please use the microphone right up here, because we have a reception right afterwards. Very generous. Yeah, just come right up to the mic.
I'm just curious. I want to hear what your feedback would be on the movies from the French cinema of 1930s, like Port of Shadows, movies like that. I think it was Carnet was the director.
Carnet.
And I mean, something that struck me was like the sense of doom, and because that movie has it, and there were some that came out.
But also, Renoir was working at that time, and he wasn't selling the doom and gloom. I think you may have cherry-picked some of the more depressing ones. But when Cahiers du Cinema took that, in retrospect, wrong stance against a certain tendency in French cinema, they were exaggerating, you know. But I think one of the high points of French cinema is money.
L'argent.
L'argent.
We saw that in Telluride a few years ago.
Not Bresson.
No. Marcel D'Herbier.
Yeah. Wow. It's a silent film. It is amazing.
And by the way, it's now available. I think Criterion Collection has it as a Blu-ray. And that one, I mean, just to extend this for a second, you should see L'Argent. It's not exactly a film noir, but it has a few of the visual elements. But I think anyone who sees Scarlet Street tomorrow, has to be aware that that is a remake of Jean Renoir's La Chienne, which is a magnificent film noir made in France in the 30s. No surprise that Fritz Lang decided to remake it. But Renoir was working with that. He also did La Bête Humaine, based on Émile Zola's novel. That's about as noir as you get, even though the film has a scale, a scope of trains, you know, traversing. It's a little bigger.
Well, and money is also Zola.
That's right. L'Argent is, yeah. I think so.
And Lang remade that as well.
Fritz Lang remade La Bête Humaine, yes, as Human Beast. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, so one of your more noirish films maybe is Hardcore, and you talked about the genealogy of Taxi Driver with Pickpocket, which of course you've gone on to make several other iterations of, but the other sort of notable influence on Taxi Driver was The Searchers, and you revisited that in Hardcore, and I wonder if you sort of made your peace with The Searchers after Hardcore, or if it still haunts you.
About a year ago, I was asked to do a commentary for Blu-ray on Hardcore, and I walked into this room and slagged the film for a better part of 2 hours. I just go, oh my God, can you believe this? Oh, he's going to move the camera. Look at that lighting. What is wrong? And so if you want to hear me, you know, attack that film for 2 hours, you can just get that Blu-ray. I don't think I knew how to direct yet. I hadn't learned how to direct yet. I learned that on the next one. And two, it was too driven by sophomoric energy. You know, it was just, I didn't have the perspective I should have had. And of course, they maybe changed the ending. And I've never forgiven, in the original ending, which was modeled after Chinatown, this guy goes into this underworld in search of his daughter, ends up seeing a snuff film, and he finds out that his daughter, Peter Boyle tells him, that his daughter was killed in a car accident 2 months before, totally unrelated to pornography, and that he has just taken this entire journey into the underworld for no reason at all, and that he has to basically go home, Jake, it's Chinatown, you know, or go home, it's North Beach. And then I thought that ending had some strength in it. And Daniel Melnick at Columbia Pictures threw down on that, and I had to change it, and I've never forgiven myself for that.
Wow. Yeah, we forgive you. Someone just said, even if you don't. We could go on for a long time because Paul Schrader is one of the most articulate people, I think, when it comes to not just film noir, but a lot of other movies. But we said this was going to be 1 hour. So I'm just going to urge you to all go see First Reformed as of June 1st, because you'll see some of this in creative development. And really, such a profound thank you, Paul, for joining us today and talking.
Thank you very much.